Iniciamos, por favor. Buen día con todos. Le damos la bienvenida al segundo día de este webinar en conmemoración al Día Mundial de la Inocuidad de los Alimentos. Las normas alimentarias son una manera de garantizar la inocuidad y calidad de los alimentos y por eso este año las normas alimentarias, la temática es las normas alimentarias salvan vidas. Esta sección está dedicada a celebrar el trabajo del Codex a nivel mundial y en nuestra región. El Códex actúa con el mandato de proteger la salud de los consumidores y garantizar la aplicación de prácticas leales en el comercio de alimentos. Es así que las normas del Códex son elementos centrales para la inocuidad de los alimentos. Ahora les invitamos a ver el siguiente video especial preparado por el secretario del Códex Alimentarios, Tom Highland, en celebración a nuestro evento regional. Por favor, ¿me ayudan transmitiendo?
Food standards are some of the unknown superheroes in this world. Unknown and uncelebrated until we created World Food Safety Day, which we are now celebrating for the 5th time. So we have done well, have we? 60 used to be a grand old age for humans. Now, for many, it is just a step to another section of an active and healthy life. Standards have helped to make this possible. Yes, we have done well. We have created a food system that feeds many safely and well, and allows them to make a living. But we still have problems. And some of them have been created by that very system that we have built. We still have problems in food security, food safety, nutrition, sustainability, and in overall fairness of distribution and income in this world that we all share. We need to transform food systems. And in the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, we need to transform the way we think about food. And for any transformation, we will need standards. Codex is starting to investigate new areas, whether it is sustainability labeling or new food sources and production methods. Codex will be there to capture the best science, knowledge, and experience that we can get to help to keep food safe, to keep us safe for at least the next 60 years. Thank you very much.
Celebramos con mucha alegría el 60º aniversario del Códex y le damos la bienvenida a nuestros expositores del día de hoy. Les recordamos mantener sus micrófonos en silencio y que al término de ambas intervenciones tendremos un espacio de preguntas, donde podrán escribir las consultas en el chat y que estaremos nosotros atentos y leyéndoles. Para iniciar tenemos a Sara Cajil, oficial senior en normas alimentarias en la Secretaría del Códex Alimentarios, quien expondrá sobre la trayectoria del Códex a nivel mundial. Bienvenida.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us to be part of your celebration of World Food Safety Day today. And I hope you can now see my screen. Okay, excellent. So, as you've heard, we're 60 years old or young this year in Codex, and to reflect that, the theme of World Food Safety Day is Food Standards Saves Lives. Excuse me, okay. This is the 5th year actually of celebrating World Food Safety Day, and it's one which we've seen really grow in recent years. And I have to say, it's thanks to country efforts led by Costa Rica that we have this event in the first place. And we're really delighted that from your region, we will have the Minister of Economy, Industry and Commerce of Costa Rica joining us virtually here in Rome tomorrow as FAO and WHO lead some of the global celebrations of World Food Safety Day. And we hope that you will be able to join us for that too, or at least some of you. So the theme for this year's World Food Safety Day is Food Standards Save Lives. And some might think that's a very bold claim, but I think as long as standards are implemented, that implementation is monitored, and standards are updated or revised to reflect changes and the new challenges to the safety of food, as our Secretary Tom Highland just mentioned, food standards will and continue to help save lives. Now, Codex has been around for 60 years, and perhaps this is a good opportunity to reflect a little bit on what Codex is. And I often like to think of Codex as both a process and a product. It's a process because Codex brings many people together. We have 189 members, 188 member countries are included in that, and 235 observers. And the Codex Alimentarius Commission and its subsidiary bodies are where all of those people come together, or where we say in our vision, the world comes together to set food safety standards and quality standards. And this process is very much driven by the members. They decide what standards we should set, when we should set them, and they also contribute to the nature of those standards. So ultimately, it's a group for members and by members. And then out of all that process, out of all that coming together, we have a product, the Codex Alimentarius, or food code. And this consists of standards, which could be qualitative or quantitative in nature. So qualitative standards might relate to something like the standard for labeling of prepackaged foods. And a quantitative standard could be the maximum limits for food additives or contaminants. We have a lot of guidelines which provide high-level principles that set out policy in certain key areas. And then we have codes of practice, which then try to be a little bit more pragmatic and provide some very specific guidance on how to address particular issues, such as the general principles of food hygiene. Now, the aim of these standards is simple. Firstly, to protect the health of consumers. And we still have a food safety gap, with an estimate of 1 in 10 people suffering from foodborne illness and almost 500,000 dying annually. So we still have work to do. And for low and middle income countries in particular, food safety can represent a huge financial burden in terms of lost productivity and medical expenses. It's been estimated to be somewhere in the region of $110 billion annually. So food safety is serious business. Now, the second aim of Codex is to facilitate fair practices in the food trade. And in the last 2 decades, trade in food and agriculture products has more than doubled. And so it's really important that we have standards in place to keep food moving, to avoid rejections at ports, to minimize food waste, and having harmonized standards like those developed by Codex are key to achieving this. Codex does have a third aim, which is to promote coordination of food standards development work. And this means that Codex should not work in isolation, but also with other standard setting bodies, be they international or regional. And one example is WOA, or the World Organization for Animal Health. And while we don't develop joint standards, we do work together to try and ensure that the standards we both develop are consistent and complement each other, so that the member countries, when they come to implement them, do not have challenges in doing so. And the reason we do this, of course, also relates to the status that Codex standards have within the World Trade Organization. They're the reference standards for food safety under the WTO Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, where it's recognized that the Codex Alimentarius Commission standards are the benchmark for the safety of food trades internationally. And they're, together with the WOA standards for animal health and the IPPC standards for plant health, these provide what we call the 3 sisters of standards which are relevant to all SPS issues. Now, Codex standards are also relevant and have been used as reference standards under the WTO TBT agreement, or the Technical Barriers to Trade. That particular agreement does not recognize in name Codex standards, but it does recognize a relevant international standard setting body. And when it comes to some issues like labeling or quality, then Codex standards are also relevant here. So we've been around for 60 years. What has Codex actually done? And we sometimes like to qualify this by saying, let's have a look at what we call our Codex scorecard. And in that time period, Codex have developed almost 11,000 different types of standards, guidelines, and codes of practice. Now, this isn't necessarily always just more and more standards, because over the years, many of those are revised. Sometimes we see standards coming together to create group standards. Sometimes we realize we don't need a particular standard anymore and it's removed. But nevertheless, the number does continue to grow. And amongst those standards, we have guidelines and codes of practice, which are the framework and kind of pragmatic guidance that are qualitative in nature and can be used by countries in different ways to help inform their legislation or their operational guidance, or even the industry when it comes to making food safer. We have standards which consist of general standards and commodity standards. And these commodity standards relate to a specific product. They could be chocolate, it could be natural mineral water, it could be cheese. These are all what we call qualitative standards. Then the quantitative standards are numerical standards, and we have thousands of these. In particular, we have nearly 6,000 maximum residue limits for pesticide residues in food, 4,500 for food additives, and then over 600 maximum residue levels for veterinary drugs in food, and then 113 maximum levels for contaminants in food. So this provides a huge resource for any country wanting to establish guidelines and regulations when it comes to food safety. And what's really important about these is knowing that they're based on science, because all of the Codex standards that we developed in relation to food safety rely on scientific advice provided by FAO and WHO. And this means that the users can be assured that the best information has been used as a basis to develop those standards. Because when FAO and WHO undertake their scientific advice, they try to collate data from all around the world so that they can have the best possible overview of the situation and then undertake the risk assessment using that data so that they can provide advice or a proposal, for example, when it comes to a limit that will be protective of populations around the world. Now, science underpins food standards in different ways. Essentially, it's the foundation for the establishment of practices, guidelines, and any other standards that keep food safe from production through to the consumer. But it also helps us to understand the risk that consumption of certain hazards poses to human health. So is it appropriate to set a limit, or should we be more protective and say that, well, this hazard shouldn't be present in a food or present at levels as low as possible? The science also provides information that guides the measures to be taken to prevent, reduce, or eliminate a hazard that could present a risk to a consumer. So it helps us understand which interventions might be effective and which may not be so effective. And more we're seeing science is contributing to innovation along the food chain, from the methods that we have to detect hazards and how to analyze them, to how to manage risks all along the food chain, to the way we actually produce food. So now in the future, we probably have to be looking at standards for maybe cell-based foods or other types of food systems and food production systems that are currently developing due to science. And science really is made up of multiple disciplines who come together, who assess the data, and then based on that assessment and their expertise, provide Codex with the best possible basis with which to underpin the standards, so that the consumer and the governments, wherever you are, can trust those standards. So now that I've told you a little bit about Codex standards, I want to talk a little bit about how they're used and give some examples of the use of Codex standards. Because we can develop all the standards in the world, but if in fact they're not used, then they're really not doing their job, which is really to save lives. And we have different types of standards, as I mentioned, and they can be applied at different levels. Guidance on hygienic food handling, for example, can be provided or applied at the farm level or by processors. Maximum levels for additives and contaminants or residues for pesticides and veterinary drugs are things that good practices need to be implemented during farming and production and processing in order to ensure that we don't exceed those levels. And then inspection services may monitor those levels in the final foods to ensure that they're being adhered to. Many times standards will tell us about how a food should be measured, packaged, or transported. And this often relates to our commodity standard and what the quality of that food should be. What are the quality criteria we should come to expect? And having these helps to provide the consumer with some assurance that it's getting a product of a certain quality and that it's suitable for its use. Often we establish as well criteria for monitoring programs. And for example, when we're monitoring, it's important to know what levels we should be monitoring to and where our limits are. So we have guidance, for example, in Codex on establishment of microbiological criteria, which can be useful in understanding the microbiological safety of food. But let's now just look at a few Codex texts and see how they're used and what their purpose really is. And the first one I want to mention are the general principles of food hygiene. This is one of our oldest texts because it was developed in 1969, just 6 years after Codex was established and met for the first time. And actually food hygiene, or developing principles on food hygiene, was one of the first priorities of Codex when it was established. But it continues to be of major importance today. And over the years, it's been revised in order to keep up with current scientific knowledge and to ensure that we're applying the best know-how when it comes to managing microbiological hazards in foods. Amongst the major milestones of this was the introduction of HACCP into the general principles of food hygiene in the late 1990s. And now we've just completed a revision in the last year where we've tried to better clarify where the relationship between HACCP and good hygiene practices lie, because both of these practically overlap in their efforts to help us produce safe food. But also our latest revision is highlighting how good hygiene practices are relevant for control of not just microbiological hazards, but things like allergens in foods and preventing cross-contamination of allergens. And it's also introducing issues like the challenges we're facing with water availability, and introduces the concept of fit for use water or fit for purpose water, so that we're using water that will not impact negatively the safety of the food in the context of its use, without always having to use potable water, which is becoming a scarce resource. Now, in the last year, we actually had a survey to see how countries were using a number of our texts. And one of these was the general principles of food hygiene. And when we asked countries about whether the texts were used to inform food legislation, policies, regulations, and programs, we saw that the majority of the respondents said they use these quite a lot or a great deal. And if you look at this bar chart here, the yellow bars relate to members that replied from the Latin American and Caribbean region. And you saw for the majority of the respondents there in those countries, they really indicated that they use the general principles of food hygiene quite a lot. When we asked the question as to whether these principles improve member states' commodity trade, so their ability to export food, again, we got a somewhat variable response, but on average, people felt, or countries felt, that mostly the general principles of food hygiene did have a positive impact in terms of improving members' capacity to trade. Now, I want to give in a few more examples that are maybe a little bit more detailed. And one of these relates to melons. And a number of years ago, actually back 15 years ago, some of you may recall, there were a lot of outbreaks related to melons. Salmonella was found in melons, different types of melons, cantaloupe, watermelon, and it was making people sick. And not only was it making people sick, this led to negative impacts on trade, because many melons lost their markets. People who were exporting melons, until they could show that their products were not causing these outbreaks of illness, markets were closed. And so this was clearly an area where work was needed to understand how can we address this problem and reduce two things. First, the impact on public health, and secondly, the negative impact on trade. And both of these, of course, are the aims of Codex. So within Codex, we already had a code of hygienic practice for fresh fruits and vegetables, very much based on the general principles of food hygiene, but targeting fresh fruits and vegetables. However, it was considered that there were some perhaps unique issues associated with melons that we needed to address in more detail. And so in 2010, the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene undertook new work to address specifically the food safety issues associated with melons. And because this was an issue that was impacting consumer health and trade, work was undertaken in a very expeditious manner and completed in 2 years. Now, when that work was completed, one of the countries that started to apply this guidance for melons was Honduras. And I've put a link to a video here if you want to hear more about that story. But essentially what it tells you is that Honduras made a lot of efforts throughout the food chain, from the primary production through the processing and washing to transportation, to ensure that the melons were not contaminated with salmonella. And by implementing these standards, they were able to prove then again that their melons were safe. And this helped to open up export markets once again. And there was a case study and a paper which highlighted some of the changes that had for the melon export from Honduras. And two major markets in North America reopened after the outbreaks of the late 2010s to melons from the country, and allowed them to actually expand their melon trade, so they were actually able to trade more than previously. They also managed to open another market in the European Union, or reopen their market to the European Union, maybe not for watermelons, but for other melons, and they were actually able to increase export to those countries. So this highlights how action taken at the national level to apply a particular Codex standard in a very rigorous manner does contribute to ensuring that a country can have access to export markets. Another example I would now like to highlight also comes from the region, from Brazil, where there was a lot of work done on the application of Codex maximum levels for mycotoxins. Now, mycotoxins is an area where Codex does a lot of work, and we have a committee on contaminants in food, which develops not only the mLs for mycotoxins, but also codes of practice to help producers and processors reduce the level of mycotoxins in food so they can actually reach these maximum levels. Now, over a decade ago, Brazil had a few limits in place, but they didn't have them for all mycotoxins, and they noticed that in Codex, levels were being developed for other mycotoxins, and also many other countries were also starting to apply limits for other mycotoxins. And they saw the vulnerability of that because they wanted to export to many of these countries, so it was important that they could demonstrate that their products met these standards. And also, when product was rejected in one port, it often moved to another, and they didn't want to be in a situation where they had to assess or reject product that was coming from other places because they had no limits of their own. So they set about updating their legislation in a stepwise manner to include more limits for mycotoxins. And in this example, I just want to highlight a couple of those, which were their efforts on ochratoxin in coffee and cocoa. And I've put in the reference here to a paper which describes some of the work that Brazil did, because it wasn't just about updating their legislation to have new limits, but what they did was they also worked closely with the industry and undertook a lot of research to understand, well, what is it that's causing the problem of mycotoxins in the first place? What are our opportunities to address this? And how do we implement appropriate measures to do this? So they were essentially first implementing a code of practice to prevent and reduce the ochratoxin contamination in cocoa and coffee. And by doing that, they were able to bring the industry to the point where they could then meet the Codex mLs for ochratoxin. So this, I think, highlights in particular the importance of a stepwise approach to applying the Codex standards, and also working carefully with the industry to ensure that they have the means by which to meet these standards. So they were just a couple of examples of how Codex texts are used in the region. Now, at the beginning of this session, Tom Hyland also mentioned, there's a lot of challenges coming to us in the future, and we need to be ready. And we do indeed have challenges due to evolving and new hazards, challenges from changing environment, changes in climate, also new technologies and new food sources, and whether we need to understand whether our existing texts will actually be good enough to ensure that these new products are also safe. And we also need to ensure that we're able to continue to keep our consumers up to date with these changes, especially as they now access food in different ways, such as through online sales. Now, some work has already started on some of these newer, maybe not so new hazards, but we're looking at new ways to manage them. And one of these is Shiga toxin producing in E. coli. And again, this is a piece of work that's been led very much by a country in the region, Chile in this case, whereby we've started to develop risk management guidance for the control of Shiga toxin-producing E. coli in a range of commodities, specifically ground beef, raw milk cheeses, leafy vegetables, and sprouts. But in addition to developing specific guidance to control the hazard in these commodities, there's also in this guidance an overview to see how can we identify when we have a problem or a Shiga toxin producing E. coli that's of greatest public health risk in our particular country. And our guidance in this area has again looked to the future and new technology to help us identify some of the virulence factors that might exist within a microorganism, and tells us how we can look for those to tell us, well, which of these organisms are of greatest risk and which not. So then you can design a monitoring program which will focus on those of greatest risk and help target your resources accordingly. So this is a text that a lot of work has been done on in the last couple of years and will actually be coming forward to the Commission in November of this year for final adoption. Another area then I wanted to highlight was, again, this area of whole water use and reuse, because this is a challenge that many of us are facing when it comes to water availability. And we started developing within Codex new guidelines on the safe use and reuse of water in food production and processing, using this concept of water fit for purpose. So this means that the water is determined to be safe for its intended purpose by understanding the potential microbiological hazards and the other relevant factors that may impact the safety of that water. And then where we need to, we include control measures such as treatment of the water, but maybe in some cases, according to the way the water is used, that's not needed. So this allows us to have more flexibility in the way we use water, and hopefully allows us to save the precious resource of potable water for those situations when it's really needed to ensure food is safe. Now, our guidance in this area, again, Honduras was one of the countries leading this work. And this consists of three parts. We have general guidance on the use and reuse of water. Then we have some work ongoing on specific guidance related to fresh fruit and vegetables and water use in that sector. And both those two sections are now complete and they're going for adoption at the end of this year by the Commission. There's two other parts of this document still in development, which relate to water use in the dairy and fisheries sector. And these will be considered further by the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene next year. But one of the interesting things about this work is how it's taken an approach to develop tools that can help a country or a processor or a food business decide how to reuse water. And this might be a little bit small, but perhaps it shows you that it's essentially a decision tree tool. So it asks you a series of questions which you can answer according to where your water is coming from and what you want to use the water for. And this will help you determine whether your water is fit for purpose for that use. And this is not the only tool within that guidance. There's several others similar to that to help you better understand how to use water in particular scenarios, including when it comes to fresh fruits and vegetables. So we see all these new tools as being very important in ensuring that Codex is ready for the future and providing countries with the necessary means to help assess new safety challenges as they arise. So I'll wrap up there, and I hope after that I've convinced you of the value of food safety standards and Codex standards in particular, and how existing standards and also new standards are trying to address the challenges that we're facing when it comes to food safety. What I do want to reiterate is that developing and applying these standards requires the efforts of all involved in the food chain. Science is really fundamental to ensuring that we have standards that are acceptable by all players in the food chain. And we will need to continue to develop new standards when it comes to new and emerging food safety issues. Codex may be approaching 60, but retirement is a long way away yet. Engagement of people is very key in order to do this. And there are many ways to achieve this, from participating in Codex meetings, to participating in working groups, to submitting comments in writing. So we hope through this means we're as open as possible to suggestions from all our members to develop standards that are fit for the future and making sure that food continues to be safe into the future. So thank you very much to you all for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Muchas gracias, Sara, por su excelente presentación y por resaltar el importante trabajo del Codex. Les recordamos que las preguntas leeremos al final de las intervenciones. Para finalizar, nos acompaña nuestro presidente regional del Comité Coordinador FAO-OMS para América Latina y el Caribe, Rommel Betancourt, quien expondrá por qué las normas alimentarias salvan vidas. Bienvenido.
Muchísimas gracias, estimada Liliana. Sara, qué gusto escucharte a los tiempos. Bienvenidos todos y todas, un placer, y a los participantes en estos 2 días de jornada, pues también nuestra gratitud y un saludo cordial desde la mitad del mundo. Efectivamente, quisiera en esta oportunidad hacer referencia y énfasis y complementar, ¿por qué no así decirlo? Lo mencionado por Sara en referencia a la importancia de las normas alimentarias, que seguramente a veces podamos sentir que son un poquito incómodas. En algún momento alguno de los operadores nos habrá sabido mencionar que las sienten pues como demasiado exigentes, pero en todo caso son necesarias. Tengo un problema ahorita con el compartir de la presentación, pero voy a seguir avanzando en aras del tiempo. Cuando ingerimos alimentos, y tenemos aquí solemos hacer una pequeña reflexión. Cuando ingerimos alimentos, ¿solemos hacerlo con confianza o con desconfianza? Esta pregunta la suelo hacer porque realmente tenemos que ingerir alimentos con la confianza de nutrirnos y no con el temor a enfermarnos. ¿Cómo sabemos entonces que los alimentos que estamos ingiriendo son inocuos? Pues mucho de ello depende de la confianza. De la confianza en cada uno de los actores de la cadena de suministros de alimentos. Los productores, acopiadores, transportistas, el beneficio en la industria, el valor agregado, los comercializadores y finalmente nuestro proveedor de alimento, que muchas veces somos nosotros mismos en casa quienes preparamos los alimentos y luego después nos remitimos paralelamente a los hábitos y a las buenas prácticas en esa manipulación de alimentos a lo largo de toda la cadena de suministros. El lavado correcto de las manos, los utensilios, las herramientas, los equipos que los utilicemos, la forma en cómo lo preparamos, el tiempo de cocción, de mantenimiento de ese alimento, si es que es refrigerado, congelado, y bueno, y Sara mencionaba algo también sobre las prácticas de higiene, y todos estos elementos se recogen en una etiqueta. No siempre los consumidores somos ávidos lectores en general, sobre todo en Latinoamérica, hay que reconocerlo, y menos aún de las etiquetas, pero absolutamente todo aquello que he mencionado está basado en normas alimentarias que nos dan la confianza, vuelvo y repito, de alimentarnos, podamos disfrutar de ellos y no caigamos enfermos. Entonces, toda esta confianza con la que venimos platicando para la elaboración y el consumo de los alimentos, sea que estos provengan de la cercanía, o sea que estos provengan de otros rincones de nuestro planeta, siguieron buenas prácticas de inocuidad, buenas prácticas de producción agropecuaria, buenas prácticas de manufactura, buenas prácticas de almacenamiento, de transporte, de consumo, etcétera. Y todo esto se presentan con claridad en forma de normas. Entonces, las normas, y quisiera invitarles gentilmente a todos ustedes, a todos nosotros, ver a ellas, a estas normas, como la base de la confianza en la ingesta de alimentos para todos nosotros. De manera que las veamos como una manera de garantizar la inocuidad y la calidad de los alimentos. Estas normas, entonces, ¿qué es lo que hacen? Ya Sara lo mencionaba, que están traducidas en directrices, códigos de prácticas, recomendaciones, de tal forma que todo este grupo de acervo normativo brinda a los productores, agricultores en nuestros países, a los elaboradores, a todos los actores de la cadena de suministro de alimentos, como decíamos, orientaciones prácticas y específicas sobre cómo manipular higiénicamente los alimentos. Y en ella vamos a encontrar nosotros que están definidos ciertos parámetros muy específicos, como los límites máximos de residuos, si se trata de plaguicidas químicos de uso agrícola o medicamentos veterinarios, si son niveles máximos, si se trata de toxinas, metales pesados o aditivos, y luego vienen criterios microbiológicos, etcétera. Estas normas especifican claramente, nos dan las pautas de cómo deberían calcularse, envasarse, transportarse los alimentos para mantener esa cadena de inocuidad. Recordemos que la responsabilidad de la inocuidad de los alimentos es tarea de todos, es una responsabilidad compartida. Y gracias a esta correcta aplicación, entonces nosotros los consumidores podemos saber finalmente si los alimentos son buenos para nosotros. En las normas también está prevista el abordaje de los alérgenos, por ejemplo. Entonces, estas normas mundiales, porque estamos hablando del Códex Alimentarios, finalmente recaen a los países, vienen a donde nosotros, y los gobiernos, las organizaciones, la industria, los consumidores, las adoptamos y las aplicamos. De tal manera que, en este caso, al ser recomendaciones emanadas por el Códex Alimentario, los gobiernos como decimos, lo adoptamos al acervo normativo basado en la confianza de que éstas están trabajadas sobre una base científica. Ya Sara también lo mencionó, lo voy a recalcar más adelante, sobre el análisis de riesgo que contempla la evaluación del riesgo y la gestión del riesgo, que abarcan los diferentes peligros físicos, químicos o biológicos y de esa manera poder mitigarlos. Es así que en este establecimiento de normas, el objetivo primordial, ya se lo ha mencionado, es la protección de la salud del consumidor, por un lado, y por otro lado, que éstas sean o aporten al establecimiento de prácticas equitativas en el comercio mundial de alimentos. Y aquí aparecemos nosotros todos, el Códex Alimentarios. Ya, Sara, también, muchas gracias. Veo que tenemos alguna información compartida mutua. Voy a resaltarlo. Representamos en el Códex el 99% del comercio mundial de alimentos. Estamos básicamente todo el mundo en la organización más grande del Sistema Onusiano de las Naciones Unidas, que abarca a 188 Estados miembros y una organización miembro que es la Unión Europea. Sumemos de los 27 estados. Entonces vemos que básicamente está el mundo ahí representado. Estamos el mundo representados, a más de las organizaciones observadoras, gubernamentales, no gubernamentales, etc. Y aquí me voy a hacer un pequeño paréntesis porque quiero mostrarles a ustedes dónde está nuestra región de Latinoamérica y el Caribe en el mundo del Códex. Entonces, en este proceso de formación o de generación, perdón, de normas del acervo normativo, hago un paréntesis porque trabajamos los gobiernos en ello basados en ciencia, somos los gestores del riesgo en Códex, los decidores, adoptamos esas normas y para que vean ustedes un poquito, quienes no están muy vinculados con la división mundial en el Códex Alimentarios, entonces mencionarles que somos 6 regiones del mundo. Está la región de África, de Asia, de Europa, de Latinoamérica y el Caribe, de Norteamérica y el Pacífico Suroccidental y el Cercano Oriente. Entonces, nosotros somos la región CECELAC y para informarles, únicamente representamos el 20% del mundo. Somos 33 estados miembros. Entonces, con nuestro mandato, ¿no es cierto?, que decíamos de la protección de la salud del consumidor y del establecimiento de prácticas equitativas en el comercio mundial de alimentos, los comités técnicos que trabajamos en Códex, ya Sara también mencionó alguno de ellos como el de higiene, por ejemplo, y sus normas. Entonces, elaboramos todo este acervo de directrices, códigos de prácticas y recomendaciones de manera transparente, inclusiva, universal, apoyados por el asesoramiento científico que nos proporcionan los órganos auxiliares, que son grupos de expertos, de científicos mundiales, que están juntados en comités conjuntos o reuniones conjuntas de la FAO y de la OMS, como JECFA para aditivos alimentarios y contaminantes, la JMPR para pesticidas químicos de uso agrícola, está GEMRA para los criterios microbiológicos y GEMNU para los nutricionales. Entonces, con todo todo este apoyo científico, la recomendación que ellos nos aportan a los comités técnicos, entonces viene la decisión mundial de adoptar estas normas que luego pasan a ser parte de ese gran resultado que también Sara lo mencionaba más adelante. Entonces, importantísimo recordar que el acervo normativo de Codex está reconocido por la OMC, utiliza las normas del Codex de la Organización Mundial del Comercio como referentes, de tal manera que en algún momento de disputas, de controversias entre países, de paneles, pues estas son las que son tomadas en cuenta, como decíamos, como referentes. Informar a ustedes que estamos cumpliendo también estamos celebrando también no solo el Día Mundial de los Alimentos, este 7 de junio, sino también estamos este año celebrando el 6º decenio del Códex Alimentarios, el 60º aniversario. Cumplimos 60 años y eso nos da a nosotros un aliento por un lado y por otro lado ese sentir esa responsabilidad de trabajar con las normas alimentarias que van de la mano con el comercio para asegurar que estos alimentos son inocuos, son nutritivos, nos fortalecen, se produzcan en cantidad suficiente para alimentar a una población cada vez mayor, cada vez más demandante y cada vez más exigente. En esta lámina no me voy a detener, Sara lo había mencionado. Quiero mencionarles también, abrir otro paréntesis, que todo este trabajo nosotros lo recogemos en un plan estratégico como gobiernos. Tenemos un plan estratégico para el quinquenio 2020-2025 que lo estamos trabajando junto con nuestras organizaciones patrocinadoras, la FAO-OMS, a través del Códex Alimentarios, los comités coordinadores y, lógicamente, los países miembros. De tal manera que mencionarles brevemente, estas son unas láminas informativas que tenemos metas, objetivos, logros, indicadores, y con ello vamos a ver qué resultados estamos y queremos obtener. Siempre, obviamente, ese mandato primero. Proteger la salud de los consumidores, lo estoy repitiendo todo el tiempo, establecer prácticas equitativas al comercio mundial de alimentos y sobre todo basadas en ciencia. Estos resultados de la Comisión del Código Alimentarios en sus 60 años, también vi que por ahí, Sara, lo presentaste de otra manera, pero simplemente yo quiero hacer nuevamente referencia a esas recomendaciones, normas directrices, códigos de prácticas que se definen en el diferente acervo normativo de Codex, nos ayudan a seguir proveyendo esa seguridad de tener al alcance alimentos sanos, nutritivos e inocuos. Quiero hacer algunas reflexiones sobre la importancia de la inocuidad alimentaria y en ello el papel fundamental que juegan las normas alimentarias y, lógicamente, la ciencia, que es nuestra luz. Recordar que no existe seguridad alimentaria sin inocuidad de los alimentos. Que la inocuidad de los alimentos va a repercutir directamente en la salud. Podríamos hablar largo y muy al detalle sobre la carga que representan las enfermedades transmitidas por alimentos y los efectos nocivos para la salud y para el desarrollo de los pueblos. Decirles que tenemos ese gran reto de bajar esas cifras de los 600 millones de personas que se enferman por enfermedades, justamente, valga la redundancia, transmitidas por alimentos, de esas muertes, de esas 420,000 muertes anuales, de esos 125,000 niños que están muriendo por causa de alimentos no seguros. Si un alimento no es seguro, deja de ser alimento y pasa a ser un factor de riesgo para la salud de quien lo consume. Deseo recalcar también que la ciencia es la clave para llevar a cabo la gestión adecuada de la inocuidad. Y eso también a nosotros nos da esa certeza y esa confianza de que las normas son de cumplimiento, no solamente voy a usar un término un poquito fuerte, por tendencias, iba a decir capricho, por tendencias de consumidores momentáneas que pueden ser legítimas en su momento, pero que no necesariamente están basadas en ciencia. La ciencia es la clave para la toma de decisiones. La inocuidad de los alimentos definitivamente tiene efectos positivos en la economía de los países y medios de vida, y la falta de inocuidad lógicamente va a tener efectos negativos. Recordemos esos 95,000 millones de dólares que se pierden al quemar contenedores, al rechazar contenedores, al disponer una destrucción de un alimento contaminado. Toda esa pérdida que significa el dejar de ir a trabajar, el tener que adquirir medicina para tratar enfermedades gastrointestinales que son que se pueden prever, y que definitivamente van a aportar a la economía y medios de vida. La inocuidad es importantísima. Protegen a los consumidores, y las normas alimentarias ayudan a los productores, transformadores, a todos aquellos miembros de la cadena de suministros de alimentos que tenemos la gran responsabilidad de alimentar. Todos, recordemos que todos somos gestores del riesgo, que la responsabilidad es compartida. Y con ello podemos entonces sí celebrar, con esa confianza, celebrar un decenio más del Códex Alimentarios y seguir nutriendo y aportando al desarrollo de nuestros pueblos. Muchísimas gracias y disculpas por ese lapsus en la presentación en un inicio. Gracias nuevamente.
Gracias, Rommel, por su intervención. Adelante, pasamos con las preguntas. Sara, por favor, nos ayuda. ¿Se ha podido identificar el género y especie de la salmonela en alimentos?
So Salmonella is one of these pathogens that have been with us for a long time, and the one we mainly associated with food is Salmonella enterica, but that's quite a complex organism, and that there's many different serotypes within that can be found in different foods. So, and we continue to find new ones, and also Salmonella, different serotypes in different foods. So Salmonella is one of those things that are found not just in foods of animal products, but also it's an organism that's very resilient. So it has the ability to persist in difficult environments, and it's been found in a lot of dried foods, and it can persist for a very long time. And it can also, even at very low levels, cause illness. So, and the thing about this organism is that it continues to evolve and change. And I recently heard a presentation from a professor calling Salmonella an old hazard with new tricks. So it continues to evolve and adapt. So we will continue to find, I think, new serotypes of Salmonella in foods, and it's one we all need to be aware of if we're to ensure our food is safe.
Perfecto, gracias. La siguiente pregunta. ¿Cómo el Códex se prepara para los problemas emergentes a nivel de inocuidad y comercialización de alimentos?
Muchas gracias. Si me permite, Sara,
So
compartir esta respuesta. Lo estamos trabajando.
Please, Rommel, go ahead.
Gracias. Lo estamos trabajando de una manera muy profunda a nivel de, no solamente de la comisión, sino también del comité ejecutivo. Tenemos algunas labores y discusiones que hemos iniciado sobre las nuevas fuentes de alimentos, las nuevas metodologías de producción para estos alimentos, los límites hasta donde Codex debe abordar esta responsabilidad y hasta qué punto los gobiernos tienen que hacerlo, sobre todo cuando hablamos de sistemas de producción. En fin, tenemos una gran labor y gran debate también, discusión. Estaba recordando un momento sobre las nuevas fuentes de proteínas, por ejemplo, cuando hablábamos de los insectos, las algas, y son temas no solamente interesantes, sino también en su momento podrían ser controversiales, porque para algunos de nosotros, en algunos estados, podría ser esto una cuestión exótica, rara, y nueva, pero hemos visto que en otras latitudes, en otros estados del mundo, son alimentos de la gastronomía tradicional, y no lo ven ni como nuevo, ni como raro, ni como exótico. pero cuando estos alimentos deseen o pretendan ingresar al comercio mundial para abastecer de nuevas fuentes proteicas, entonces ahí sí nosotros tenemos que tomar a cargo la gestión del riesgo para asegurar que, lógicamente, sus nuevos usos o sus usos en latitudes, pues, que antes no los solían abordar, sean seguros, y para ello vamos a necesitar de estándares. Seguramente los comités actuales vigentes que están trabajando en la gestión del riesgo tengan que tomar estas responsabilidades de acuerdo a sus competencias, o en su momento seguramente tengamos que discutir y ver la necesidad de abrir algún grupo de acción gubernamental o un nuevo grupo de trabajo, etcétera, ver las maneras de cómo lo canalizamos. De todas maneras, lo estamos trabajando. No sé, querida Sara, si gustas añadir algo al respecto. Muchas gracias de mi lado.
Thank you, Roman. No, I think you've covered all the efforts in Codex. I think what we're seeing is that we need to create a space within Codex to discuss these new issues. And recently in our committee on contaminants in food, we had a very interesting side event which started looking at some of the new issues that are emerging. And that committee agreed to even continue having an agenda item which would allow it to have ongoing discussions on new and emerging issues, so it can consider each of them as they arise and then determine whether it's appropriate to develop a Codex text or not. So I think the important thing is that the conversation needs to stay open on these issues, and we need to have a space where all our members can feel free to raise the issues that they are finding and the new challenges that they are having to face, so that we can work together within Codex to address them.
Muy amable. Gracias, Sara. Gracias, Romer. Siguiente pregunta. Se han recibido cifras alarmantes como 420,000 personas muertas por alimentos contaminados. ¿Cómo el Codex interviene en reducir estos números?
Si me permite, Sara, podríamos compartir también la respuesta. Es una tarea igualmente compartida, no solamente entre CODES, quienes somos los gestores del riesgo y adoptamos las normas, recomendaciones, directrices, sino también en la población. Por un lado, cuando me refiero a la población, hablo de toda la cadena de suministro de alimentos, cómo nos responsabilizamos del cumplimiento de estas normas. Y por otro lado estamos los gobiernos y las agencias de vigilancia y control, los planes nacionales de vigilancia y control de contaminantes en los alimentos. ¿De qué manera lo estamos nosotros, estamos asumiendo esta grata y a la vez ingrata tarea de convertirnos en los policías, de determinar si ciertos alimentos están siendo contaminados o no, y su destrucción? Es por eso que es importante la comprensión de la ciudadanía. Hablo por experiencias propias acá. Yo hablo desde Ecuador, cuando a veces, tal vez no con mala intención, pero sí con desconocimiento, me atrevo a decirlo, se filtran en redes sociales fotografías de la disposición final de un alimento contaminado y se hace ver a la población como que se está destruyendo y botando alimentos, y no es así. Lo que estamos haciendo es justamente emitiendo una disposición final de un alimento que dejó de serlo porque perdió su integridad, pasó a ser un factor de riesgo para la salud de quien lo consume, y definitivamente no puede no puede llegar a una mesa de los consumidores. Están los ministerios de salud pública también, la responsabilidad de hacer vigilancia y control en las partes de la cadena que les competen, y sobre todo también llevar un control de cifras actualizado, vigente, para ver de qué manera nos juntamos todos, productores, digamos, el sector privado, el sector público, y comenzar a establecer medidas de mitigación del riesgo. Pero hay un sector también importantísimo que es la academia. La academia, con sus investigaciones, yo suelo invitar gentilmente siempre a hacer esas tesis, a realizar ciencia aplicada, de tal manera que la academia con sus luces, con la ciencia que habíamos mencionado tanto en la presentación, nos den esas pautas de por dónde seguir. Entonces yo suelo hablar de un triángulo equilátero, que es una figura geométrica pues perfecta, me gusta mucho, del sector público, el sector privado y la academia juntos para trabajar en esas cifras y poder bajarlas. Escuché ayer de la presentación de la OPS que se va a hacer una actualización para 2025, a ver qué resultados estamos dando. Hasta ahí mi respuesta. No sé, Sara, igualmente si gustas algo complementar. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Rommel. And I think listening to you, the message I took away was what our overarching purpose of World Food Safety Day is, which is food safety is everyone's business. If we really want to make a difference and reduce, as you mentioned, Liliana, the number of foodborne illnesses, we all have to play a role. And Codex is just part of that. We try to come together and agree on the best approaches that will help us reduce these hazards in foods and make sure that the food is not contaminated. But without all the other players in the chain playing their role, whether it's the farmers implementing good agriculture or good hygiene practices, the food processors applying HACCP, and then the inspection services monitoring that all of these measures are taking place. Without all that joint effort, it's very difficult to reduce foodborne illness. But one of the great things I think we're seeing with World Food Safety Day is we're creating much more awareness about these issues. And it's also important that consumers are aware of the challenge, and by voicing, I guess, their concerns, we try to put pressure. We ensure that the government are aware of the issue and that they need to take and put in place the appropriate policies to address food safety and help drive that change that's necessary to ensure food safety. So we all have a role to play. We all have to make an effort. And I really believe if we all work together, we can actually achieve this reduction in foodborne disease. However, it just takes one break in that chain for these contaminants to get back in and cause illness. So working together is critical to reducing the number of foodborne illnesses. Thank you.
Y tal vez, Lili, si me permites añadir algo, Sara, el rol que cumplimos los consumidores, no solamente de manera organizativa para presionar a los proveedores de alimentos a que nos provean de alimentos sanos, nutritivos, inocuos, y presionar a los gobiernos para que tengan pues una vigilancia y control estricto sobre ellos. El rol nuestro en una reflexión muy sencilla y simple. Muchas veces, ¿de qué sirve que todo esto esté tan bien alineado, de que haya una buena práctica agrícola, una buena práctica de manufactura, las normas, etcétera? Si los consumidores al final, en nuestras casas, en nuestras mesas, en nuestros refrigeradores, echamos a perder la inocuidad. Como decía Sara, es una responsabilidad de todos. Si el momento de la preparación de los alimentos no nos lavamos correctamente las manos, no tenemos uñas cortadas, no hemos congelado o refrigerado bien los alimentos y los dejamos caducar, si en las compras los dejamos en el vehículo, en un calor de la mitad del mundo, en la cajuela, a los alimentos congelados, los refrigerados, los frescos, y nos vamos a comer un ceviche acá en Ecuador, a ver el fútbol o a la misa, en fin. Miren el rol importante que tenemos nosotros los consumidores. Regresemos mucho a ver nosotros cuáles son esos hábitos, cómo debemos mejorarlos y de esa manera comenzar la gestión para el cambio. Gracias.
Gracias, Rommel. Gracias, Sara. Sara, por favor, tenemos una pregunta complemento al tema de salmonela. ¿Qué metodologías se han aplicado para comenzar a identificar género y especie de salmonela?
Well, I think this is an area which continues to evolve, and we've had a number of serotyping methods that have been used and developed over many years to help us better identify which serotypes of Salmonella, these types of agglutination tests that have been used. But now more and more, of course, we're seeing the influence of the gene sequencing technology playing a role in helping us have a better understanding of the types of Salmonella that are other microorganisms as well that are present in our food. Of course, these are not methods that we can use every day just yet to identify Salmonella, but what they are doing is they're helping us to better understand where Salmonella is coming from and help us to trace back the source to some of these outbreaks of Salmonella and other pathogens. So methodologies play a huge role, not just in monitoring, but also with these new gene-based methods. They give us more insight into the origins of pathogens and help us, as a result, to understand where we need to target our interventions in order to reduce them within our food. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Tenemos una pregunta para usted, Rommel. ¿Cómo la región de América Latina y el Caribe se ajusta a estas normas y cómo interfiere en el comercio de alimentos?
Muchas gracias a Lili y a la persona que lo ha gestionado la pregunta, ha emitido la pregunta, digamos. Yo debo reconocer personalmente una gran evolución de nuestra región en todo sentido. Latinoamérica y el Caribe es un gran proveedor de alimentos al mundo y también es un gran consumidor de estos alimentos porque generalmente nos autoabastecemos. Y la región de América Latina y el Caribe en esta evolución propositiva se ha alineado muchísimo al acervo normativo internacional, a la armonización de las normas, en este caso a la adopción de las normas del Códex Alimentarios, y esto se lo está traduciendo en cada uno de nuestros países, con nuestros gobiernos, en el fortalecimiento de los sistemas nacionales de inocuidad de los alimentos, y en ellos todos los planes y programas de vigilancia y control de alimentos. Hemos visto evoluciones extremadamente y ejemplos extremadamente buenos. Ayer tuvimos una plática muy interesante durante el día, el ejemplo de OIRSA y del Caribe sobre la trazabilidad. Fue muy grato escuchar cómo ha evolucionado muchísimo la región de Mesoamérica. Tenemos ejemplos muy fuertes también en el Cono Sur. Los andinos no nos estamos quedando detrás, estamos trabajando, si bien es cierto, tenemos un poco de ralentización en el tema de la trazabilidad para fortalecer los sistemas de inocuidad, pero todos estamos avanzando. Definitivamente hay retos todavía, no hay cómo negarlo. Hay brechas todavía gigantes que saldar, pero lo importante es el que estamos los gobiernos trabajando. Yo quisiera por ahí escuchar desde un tercero, y por ahí, Sara, tú nos puedes comentar algo al respecto sobre cómo la región ha evolucionado mucho también en su participación en la arena del Códex Alimentario. Es una participación en la que estamos ya liderando grupos de trabajo y temas, y gracias a ese liderazgo de los grupos de trabajo y los temas que se han abordado en ellos, hemos logrado también normas mundiales bajo el liderazgo de la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Y esto es importante resaltarlo. Esos debates en los que participamos con los expertos de nuestra región, con tesis muy fuertes y fundamentadas, son cada vez más escuchados y valorados en la arena mundial. Pero bueno, yo lo digo de este lado de la mesa, pero por ahí, Sara, también lo puedes complementar con ojos desde el secretariado. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ro. Gracias. Adelante, Sara.
No, I think Rommel has answered this question very well, and I think when I presented earlier, my focus was really to highlight how active this region has been in Codex and bring issues that are clearly very important when it comes to food trade and consumer protection to the table in Codex. Because as I said, Codex is member driven, so we can only respond to those issues that members raise, and this is why the engagement is so important. And I think the region has been working very well together to coordinate their efforts so that they are having their voice heard at Codex, and the issues that are very important for them are coming to the table, and hopefully we're addressing them in a way that's actually helping the region to address these challenges. Thank you.
Muy amable, Sara. La siguiente pregunta. ¿Cómo interviene la ciencia en el Códex?
So how does science intervene in Codex, if I understood correctly? Okay, so within Codex, we let me take a little step back, because when the WTO came into being in 1995 and Codex was mentioned as one of the reference texts within the SPS agreement, that clearly indicated that these texts were recognized because they should be based on science. And while scientific advice has been the basis for Codex texts for many years, JECFA, which is an FAO WHO expert body, providing scientific advice on food additives and contaminants and residues of veterinary drugs existed even before Codex. So we've always had that scientific basis. But in the late 1990s, we decided in Codex to really make it clear how we use science and started adopting risk analysis principles to the way we work, which means that anytime we take a risk management decision, Codex is a risk management body, we need to take into account the relevant risk assessments. And FAO and WHO are the ones who undertake the risk assessments based on scientific advice. So all that scientific information that comes from FAO and WHO is the foundation of food safety standards within Codex. That's the basis on which the initial agreement is built. And it really is critical to finding consensus within Codex, because mostly we can agree on the science when the risk assessments have been done in a transparent and rigorous way, which is what FAO and WHO do for Codex. So science is essentially the basis of our standards in Codex. Roman, maybe you want to add more.
Muchísimas gracias, Sara, por esa vasta explicación. Únicamente recordar a todos algo que mencionamos a lo largo de la presentación también. Hay 4 grupos de asesoramiento científico que aportan con la evaluación del riesgo y aportan, digo, con datos o con recomendaciones para la gestión y la toma de decisión de los gobiernos dentro de cada comité y al final de la comisión. Pero hay algo que yo quisiera resaltar al respecto. La importancia de nosotros, los países, y cuando hablo de ello me refiero nuevamente a este triángulo del sector público, privado y academia, de generar datos. Para tomar una decisión necesitamos datos, obviamente, científicos, y estos datos los proveemos los gobiernos. Realmente ese es uno de los grandes retos y debo resaltar también una evolución positiva de los países de nuestra región en materia del fortalecimiento de las capacidades analíticas. No solamente laboratorios con equipamiento, sino también con técnicos especializados, con metodologías adoptadas, con adopción de estándares internacionales para que estas metodologías sean avaladas, como la 17025, de tal manera que debemos generar data. Y otro de los grandes retos que tenemos, en los que tenemos que trabajar, a pesar de que ha habido una positiva evolución, es el no tener miedo en publicar estos datos en las bases mundiales, en las bases de Alimentos, por ejemplo, de la OMS, porque es de ahí de donde los grupos de asesoramiento científico toman la data para la evaluación del riesgo. Si no proveemos data a los países, si no mostramos incluso datos que muestren dificultad, que muestren problemas, entonces difícilmente esa evaluación del riesgo de los órganos asesores científicos va a poder ser realmente representativa a nivel mundial, y esa toma de decisión va a ser objetiva como lo pretendemos. Gracias.
Muy amable, Romel. Siguiente pregunta. ¿En qué norma del Códex podemos encontrar los criterios de aceptación microbiológicos por tipo de alimentos?
So within Codex, we have guidelines for the establishment of microbiological criteria for foods, but we do not have very many criteria for specific foods. And the reason for this is a number of years ago, when we introduced HACCP, for example, into the general principles of food hygiene, it was agreed to have a more preventative-based approach to food safety rather than an end product testing approach. So Codex did not develop very many more microbiological criteria by food, but rather they provided guidance on how people can develop micro criteria when they're needed, for example, as part of their monitoring programs. Now, we do provide guidance for a few foods when it comes to microbiological criteria, and one of these is for powdered infant formula, because this is a product that's intended for infants and young children, so a very vulnerable group. So we have a particular hygienic code related to powdered infant formula, and within that we have specified the microbiological criteria for Salmonella and Chronobacter, and we have also developed what we call the performance criteria how many Enterobacteriaceae you should detect in your system to help you understand if you have problems with hygiene, for example. Another area where we have developed microcriteria is Listeria monocytogenase in ready-to-eat foods. And this is an area where we have different criteria according to the ability of the food to support growth of Listeria. So for foods that can support growth, the criteria is, you know, the absence in 25 grams, where if the food cannot support the growth of Listeria, then it's feasible to have up to 100 CFU per gram. And one other example where we provide some food-specific guidance on microbiological criteria is on salmonella when it comes to dried foods, because dried foods, salmonella can be there in very low numbers and still cause some illness. So that's another area where we have provided some specific guidance. So in general, we don't provide it, but in certain situations, like I have just mentioned, we do provide specific microbiological criteria because of the vulnerable population or the particular high risk provided by that particular microorganism. Thank you.
Muy amable, Sara. La siguiente pregunta. ¿Cuál es el enfoque desde el Códex en materia de fraude alimentario?
Muchísimas gracias, Lili. El fraude alimentario lo abordamos en el Comité Códex sobre sistemas de inspección y certificación de importaciones y exportaciones de alimentos. De hecho, tuvimos una última reunión en mayo de este año y uno de los puntos de agenda que abordamos los países fue el anteproyecto de orientaciones sobre la prevención y el control de fraude en los alimentos. Eso por un lado. Por otro lado, recordar que hay documentos actuales vigentes referentes al fraude alimentario. Está, entre otros, el Código de Ética para el Comercio Internacional de Alimentos, incluyendo transacciones en condiciones de favor y ayuda alimentaria. El fraude alimentario en lo que está en etiquetado, inadecuado, inexacto, falso, engañoso, está abordado en la norma general para el etiquetado de los alimentos preenvasados. Está también abordado en la norma general para el etiquetado de aditivos alimentarios que se venden como tales. Y bueno, tenemos un acervo normativo bastante amplio. No quisiera detenerme, pero sí mencionar uno de los últimos trabajos que Codex adoptó. Son los principios y directrices de la evaluación y el uso de programas voluntarios de aseguramiento por parte de terceros. Y eso por un lado. Y por otro lado, pues, recordemos que dentro de nuestros miembros están las organizaciones miembros. Hay organizaciones internacionales que están trabajando también en la esfera del fraude alimentario, como la FAO, está la Iniciativa Mundial de Seguridad Alimentaria, INSA, y bueno, y muchos otros. Está también la Organización Internacional de Policía Criminal, la Interpol, porque estos en algún momento también pues pasa la barrera de la inocuidad alimentaria y entra ya en problemas de criminalidad. Está también el Instituto Interregional de las Naciones Unidas para investigaciones sobre la delincuencia y la justicia. En fin, tenemos una serie de abordaje, por un lado, dentro de SSFIX y por otro lado, normas adoptadas y también el trabajo conjunto con otras organizaciones. Gracias. Y igualmente, Sara, te invito a compartir la respuesta si gustas añadir algo. Adelante.
I think you've covered everything, Rommel. Hopefully in the next few years, we'll have guidelines specifically on this area due to the work you just mentioned going on in CCFIX. But I think as you highlighted, you know, one of the best ways to address food fraud is to have strong food control systems. And we have a number of standards that are helping to guide countries in terms of how they can build strong food control systems with strong food inspection systems. And by having these functional and in place, we can hopefully address many food fraud issues before ever they become a problem, because we're proactive in terms of our approach to food safety and food quality. Thank you.
Muy amable. La siguiente pregunta. ¿Qué proyectos de trabajo tiene el Códex en el ámbito de los piensos? ¿Existe una agenda de trabajo en esta área? Sara, por favor.
So currently, right now, there's not specific work going on in relation to feed, but this is an area where Codex has been very active in the past. And I think in Codex, we recognize that food safety starts, or safe food starts with safe feed. So we have guidelines in relation to producing safe feed, and we have guidelines that will help countries undertake risk assessments of the hazards that are associated with feed. And we've also worked with FAO and the feed industry to provide additional materials and manuals to help countries implement the existing guidelines related to feed. Of course, you know, some of our existing work like that in relation to antimicrobial resistance, which was finished just a couple of years ago, also considered the role of feed safety in ensuring that food is safe. And we have ongoing work in relation to residues of pesticides in food, which also cover many of the forage crops that go to feed animals for food production. So while we may not be working explicitly on feed right now, many of the areas where work are going on, such as in pesticide residues or even in hygiene, also are relevant to feed. And we keep in close contact with partners in FAO in particular to ensure that we are kept aware of any new and emerging issues in the feed area, so that these can be addressed through some of our existing committees, such as the Committee on Contaminants in Food or the Committee on Pesticide Residues or any other committee. So it may not have a committee named feed, but it crosses the work of several of the existing committees within Codex. Thank you.
Únicamente, perdón, Sara, muchas gracias por la respuesta. Si me permites añadir a lo que tú comentaste, recordar que tenemos la clasificación de alimentos y piensos adoptada en Codex y como perfectamente ya lo mencionó Sara, gran parte de este trabajo se lo está abordando en el Comité Codex sobre residuos de pesticidas, en donde constantemente se está actualizando esta directriz. Gracias.
Gracias. Siguiente pregunta. Respecto a la responsabilidad de los consumidores en el tema de la cultura en inocuidad alimentaria, el consumidor no siempre sabe lo que debe hacer para preservar la inocuidad. ¿Se tiene trabajo o desarrollo de instrumentos en esta materia? Gracias y feliz día, nos escriben.
Muchas gracias, feliz día. A ver si empiezo yo, Sara, si me permites, con algunas reflexiones. Esto los países lo estamos abordando al seno de nuestras legislaciones y políticas de manera diversa. Hay muchas experiencias de un trabajo de educomunicación a nivel de inocuidad de los alimentos en distintas latitudes. De todas maneras, es algo en que, sin nombrar ni regiones, ni subregiones, ni países, ¿no es cierto?, pero resaltar que es un tema donde debemos trabajar mucho más efusiva y eficientemente para tener consumidores responsables y consumidores bien informados a futuro. Y cuando hablo a futuro, me refiero de un trabajo con los niños. Una iniciativa que, por ejemplo, en Ecuador tomamos hace algunos años, pero debo reconocer, debemos rescatarla y resaltarla, es la labor con el Ministerio de Educación Pública, la formación de maestros y docentes con niños, ¿verdad? Para que a su vez a través de ellos podamos gestionar una cultura de cambio con los padres. Es mucho más complejo cambiar los hábitos y cultura de nosotros, los padres, los adultos, y mucho más fácil enseñar y educar y que sean los niños los promotores de estos cambios. De todas maneras, como digo, hay muchas iniciativas rescatables en todos los países de nuestra región, pero también hay brechas y necesidades de un mayor abordaje. Gracias. Sara, te invito gentilmente también a compartir la respuesta.
Thank you, Rommel. I think you've addressed it well. In Codex, of course, our main target audience is governments rather than consumers, but still through some of our work, particularly on the labeling committee, you know, we have the opportunity to focus in on what kind of information is important for consumers and to identify what type of information should be incorporated onto food labels to help ensure that consumers are getting appropriate messaging about their food. Within Codex, we try to use particularly our social media channels to share messages, and in the question you indicated consumers don't often know, and even through World Food Safety Day, we're trying to give very short, succinct messages that are aiming at consumers to help them better understand some of the issues relating to food, whether it's the importance of hand hygiene, how to keep hot foods hot and cold food cold, and also we link in that to key messages from WHO, like on the 5 keys to safer food. So we still have a lot of work to do to reach all consumers, but we're trying to prepare or develop small bites of information that will help them better understand their role in food safety. Thank you.
Muy amable. Y la última pregunta. ¿El Códex tiene algún protocolo o criterio para las empresas procesadoras de cárnico, en específico los establecimientos de animal, establecimientos de beneficios animal?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? It didn't come through very clearly. Thank you.
Vamos. ¿El Códex tiene algún protocolo o criterio para las empresas procesadoras de cárnicos, en específico los establecimientos de beneficios animal?
In fact, in Codex, we have the Code of Hygienic Practice for meat. So this goes through the whole meat process and provides guidance on what needs to be done from the time the animal enters the slaughterhouse right through to the consumer in terms of the measures taken to reduce the potential hazards. So we have general guidance on meat hygiene. We then have a number of codes of practice which look at specific pathogens that can be found in meat, like Salmonella in beef and pork, Campylobacter and Salmonella in poultry. And within those guidelines, we provide specific measures that can be taken along the slaughterhouse and food chain to help ensure that you can minimize their presence in the final product. So this is an area where we have quite a lot of guidance within Codex, and it's available on our webpage, particularly under the area of food hygiene and meat hygiene. Thank you.
Muy amable, Sara. Se quedaron algunas preguntas, vamos a contestar en el chat y pasamos al siguiente espacio. Les agradecemos a nuestros expositores por toda la dinámica de su metodología de exposición. Y vamos a arrancar el siguiente punto, que es un video. Les invitamos a ver el siguiente video preparado por el presidente de la Comisión del Códex Alimentarios, Steve Warner, en celebración a nuestro evento regional.
Hello there, my name is Steve Wern and I'm Chair of the Codex Alimentarias Commission. And my thanks for the invitation to participate in your event to celebrate World Food Safety Day 2023 and the 60th anniversary of the Codex Alimentarias Commission. I'd like to start asking a simple question. When you eat, how do you know your food is safe? You've hopefully washed your hands, cleaned your kitchenware and cooked your food to the right temperature, all good food safety practices. You may have read the food safety label to see what ingredients the product contains or how to cook it. And perhaps without realizing it, you've trusted everyone involved in growing, processing, packaging, distributing and preparing your food in the right way so that you can enjoy it without becoming one of the 600 million people worldwide who fall ill from contaminated food each year. That burden of foodborne illness affects all countries. And over 200 diseases can be caused by eating food contaminated with bacteria, viruses, parasites, or chemical substances such as heavy metals. And while children under 5 make up just 9% of the global population, they carry 40% of the foodborne disease burden. Your food is safe, and your trust is justified because the people involved in making your food, whether at your home or on the other side of the world, followed established food safety practices, which are transparently available in the form of standards. In other words, food standards form the bedrock of trust and protection for all of us. food standards save lives. They provide guidance on hygienic food handling for farmers and processors. They define the maximum levels of additives, contaminants, and residues of pesticides and veterinary drugs that can safely be consumed by all. They specify how the food should be monitored, packaged, and transported to keep it safe. And thanks to the application of standards on things like nutrition and allergen labelling, consumers can know whether the food will be good for them. Most governments and organisations adopt and enforce food standards that are based on scientific risk assessments, covering hazards that are biological, chemical, and physical in nature. The standards can be developed by those individual governments or organisations, or by intergovernmental standard-setting bodies. One such international food safety and quality standard-setting body is the Codex Alimentarius Commission, or Codex for short. Codex is the place where representatives of 188 member countries work together to develop standards that protect consumer health and ensure fair practices in the food trade, with input from around 240 observer organisations, including industry and consumer associations. Used by governments and by the food industry too, Codex standards guide national food safety legislation and ensure best practices. Codex standards are at the heart of food safety. They have been for 6 decades. Each year, the food code grows. New standards are introduced and existing standards are updated when new data becomes available. And in 2023, as Codex celebrates its 60th anniversary, we also celebrate food standards for defining the path to safe food for everyone, everywhere. Thank you.
Gracias a nuestros expositores. Ha sido una jornada gratificante y nos ha permitido no solo conocer realidades nacionales, sino la historia del Codex. También agradecemos a nuestros participantes y les recordamos que la inocuidad de los alimentos es un asunto de todos. No importa quién sea ni a quién se dedique, usted desempeña una función importante para velar porque el consumo de alimentos sea seguro. Finalmente, queremos felicitar a los participantes de nuestro concurso de dibujo digital y quisiera invitar en este caso o resaltar al ganador del primer lugar, que es la Cooperativa Agropecuaria de Servicios Santo Tomás de Nicaragua. Luz María Hurtado es la gerente de la cooperativa. Por favor, le escuchamos. Bienvenida. Está con el micrófono apagado.
Y ahora sí. Buenos días a todos, muy buenas. Nosotros somos de la Cooperativa Agropecuaria de Servicios Santo Tomás, Nicaragua. Procesamos productos lácteos y estamos directamente comprometidos con la inocuidad de los alimentos. Para nosotros tiene un significado grande el poder ser partícipes de esta gran responsabilidad que es la inocuidad en los alimentos que nosotros procesamos, porque de esta manera nosotros salvamos vidas y para eso es para nosotros una responsabilidad grande. Nos sentimos contentos por haber obtenido el primer lugar y estamos muy agradecidos con la participación de todos. Tengo acá el dibujito que tenemos compartiendo ahí en pantalla. El dibujo que nos llevó a este primer lugar. Agradecerles a todas las organizaciones que han estado apoyándonos en esta excelente gestión. Muy agradecido sobre todo, ¿verdad? Por obtener el primer lugar en el dibujo. Y siempre, como les digo, comprometidos con la inocuidad de los alimentos. En nombre de los asociados de la cooperativa, le damos la gracia por haber estado participando acá y darnos este pequeño espacio. Muchas gracias.
Muy amable, gracias, Luz. Felicitaciones. En el segundo lugar, me permito indicar el diseñador independiente Roland Bastidas de Quito, Ecuador. Bienvenido. Le damos la bienvenida. Adelante.
Hola, saludos a todos y todas. Ahora sí se activó la cámara. Sí se activó. Bueno, hola, saludos con todos y todas. Mil gracias por la oportunidad de participar en el concurso de dibujo. Felicidades a la Cooperativa Agropecuaria de Servicios Santo Tomás por el primer lugar. De igual manera, saludos a todo el equipo organizador por su arduo trabajo y dedicación en la realización de estos eventos. Son muy importantes, muy necesarios, pues para la promoción de la salud pública, ya que las normas alimentarias son esenciales para prevenir enfermedades y garantizar que los alimentos que nosotros consumimos sean seguros y de alta calidad. Gracias de nuevo por este increíble reconocimiento que me incentiva igual a seguir trabajando y muy agradecido de poderles apoyar desde el diseño gráfico.
Muchas gracias, Rola. Les agradecemos nuevamente por su presencia y esperamos encontrarnos en el próximo año con nuevas actividades y siempre celebrando la inocuidad de los alimentos. Sigan atentos a nuestras redes sociales para información y les invitamos a participar en los diferentes eventos que se están realizando en el mundo para celebrar el Día Mundial de la Inocuidad de los Alimentos. Muchas gracias, buen día. Y nada más antes de finalizar, si es que me ayudan mirando a la cámara. A la cuenta de 3. Gracias. Ay, ya, Gravita. Eso, muchas gracias. Lore, un poquito, si te ubicas. Perfecto, gracias. Gracias, Dani, porfa. Gracias, chicos.
Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias, Lili. Gracias por ese apoyo.
Gracias a todos.
Felicitaciones a los
Felicitaciones.